Hi everyone, and welcome to Truth Over News. You've probably seen the famous photo of the participants in the 1927 Solvay conference in Brussels, Belgium. Max Born, Niels Bohr, Marie Curie, Albert Einstein, Werner Heisenberg, Hendrik Lorentz, Wolfgang Pauli, Max Planck, and Erwin Schrödinger, as well as many others. Never in history were there so many incredibly gifted people all in the same place at the same time. Modern civilization is built on what these people in that one photo discovered, from quantum physics to atomic energy and everything else in between. Well, now there's a similar photo, only that everything is inverse. We're talking about the group photo taken at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in 2018, soon after a blueprint was drawn up for making COVID in a lab. The inverse Solvay photo features all the people we've gotten to know to be implicated in the COVID origin saga. Zhengli, Ralph Baric, Peter Daszak, Wang Linfa, and many others. But there's also Xiangguo Qiu, the woman who worked on Ebola while undercover for the Chinese government in a Canadian government lab, and who then fed classified information and viruses to China. What connects all these people? Why were they all there? And what does the Canadian lab situation have to do with COVID? What are the chances that shortly after the diffuse blueprint for making COVID in a lab, all the main protagonists would find themselves in Wuhan? Probably quite high if the visit was connected with the blueprint. And so it seems. We've covered diffuse on this show in the past, so we won't rehash all its details other than to say that diffuse was a 2018 blueprint for making a virus just like COVID in a lab. The proposal was concealed from the public when COVID arrived in 2019. We only found out about it in September of 2021 when a whistleblower leaked it. To this day, it is probably the most important smoking gun evidence for the fact that COVID came out of the Wuhan lab, especially when you consider the effort made by its authors, Zhengli, Ralph Baric, Peter Daszak, and Wang Linfa, to cover up its existence. And all those same people who wrote the blueprint and then covered it up happened to be at the Wuhan Institute of Virology only a few months after that blueprint was put together. The official reason why they were there was that the 8th International Symposium on Emerging Viral Diseases was taking place at the Wuhan lab. But the real reason appears to have been to talk about ever more reckless experiments making ever more dangerous viruses in labs, and perhaps something even more nefarious than that. That is because the 4 diffuse authors aren't the only people of note in the photo. There were other hugely important people there as well. For instance, Linda Safe. Linda Safe was one of Peter Daszak's associates, and she signed Daszak's fraudulent Lancet letter, which claimed that anyone who even suggested that COVID might have come out of a lab was a conspiracy theorist who was spreading fear and prejudice. Danielle Anderson was also there, and she's also in the photo. She's a virologist who worked closely with Zhengli, the director of the Wuhan lab. Anderson is known for her hyper-advocacy of the natural origin for COVID. For instance, she was the person who authored that absolutely ridiculous frozen food hoax paper. That was the paper which claimed that COVID was imported into China through frozen food. Unsurprisingly, the paper had to be withdrawn. And then there's another Fauci-funded scientist in the photo, Shi Pei-yong from the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston. If that sounds familiar, that's probably because we've often talked about this university in connection with Fauci's stateside lab, the Galveston National Lab, which is run by the University of Texas Medical Branch. Now, you may recall from previous shows that the Galveston National Lab trained Wuhan lab staff, and that its director, a man called James LeDuc, was deeply entangled with the Wuhan lab. He actually worked there for a year. When COVID struck, Leduc knew the truth, and he reached out to a man called Yuan Jiming, the Chinese Communist Party's official in charge of the Wuhan lab. Yuan was a close friend of Leduc, and right after COVID started, Leduc privately urged his friend Yuan to get his story straight on the lab leak. Yuan did not reply, but Leduc had another exchange with Yuan later on, in which Xi Peiyong played a part. That exchange was about Senator Marco Rubio's efforts in April of 2020 to investigate the lab origin of COVID. Apparently, Leduc was warning the Wuhan lab about this. There's also Shibo Jiang. Despite working in a hostile country, at Fudan University to be precise, Shibo Jiang received millions of dollars in funding from Fauci. At this point, you can't help but wonder whether anyone in that Wuhan lab photo was not funded by Fauci. One of Shibo Jiang's Fauci-funded projects is called RBD, recombinant protein-based SARS vaccine for biodefense. What this means is that Fauci was giving US taxpayer money to a virologist in Fudan, China, to play around with COVID-like viruses for biodefense. It says it right there on the NIH's website. A SARS coronavirus may appear in humans due to accidental release from a lab or deliberate spreading of the virus by a bioterrorist attack. Therefore, an effective and safe vaccine is urgently needed for preventing future SARS outbreaks and for biodefense preparedness. You read that correctly. Fauci was funding Chinese scientists to develop vaccines against COVID-like viruses that might either leak out of labs, the same labs which were being funded to make these viruses, which is probably the dumbest idea anyone has ever heard of, or against the use of COVID-like viruses as bioweapons. Those are not our conclusions. That is what the NIH website says. And all of this was happening in 2015. And then the guy who was being funded by Fauci showed up with Daszak and the rest of the COVID crew at the Wuhan lab in 2018 on that photo. There are many others we could talk about who were also there and who are also in that photo, including someone from the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda. That just happens to be the Pentagon's Medical Research University. What was that guy doing there? Plus, we haven't even identified all the people in the photo. There are probably going to be other shoes that will drop. But there's one person we know is in the photo, but who hasn't been mentioned much in connection with COVID. Xiangju Chu. You probably heard that name recently in connection with the Canadian lab scandal. Xiangguo Chu and another Chinese scientist, Chu's husband, Qiding Cheng, worked at the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. They were both thrown out of the lab in July of 2019, before COVID hit. But they were not fired. That only happened in 2021. So we knew something strange was going on with Chinese scientists being fired from a Canadian national lab, but we did not know the details, and we also did not know that there was a Wuhan connection. But that has now changed. That is because the documents surrounding Chu's case have been released, finally. By documents, we mean a 623-page bundle, a lot of which remains redacted. As to why it took so many years to release those documents, well, that is something that Canada appears to have in common with the US federal government. The 623-page document bundle was put together by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which is a sort of Canadian equivalent of the CIA. We say sort of because the Canadian version focuses on narrower tasks in the area of security intelligence, but in general, you can think of them as similar. The thrust of the media reporting has been that Chu managed to secretly smuggle engineered Ebola and Nipah viruses out of the Canadian lab and into China. And not just into China, but to the Wuhan lab. Now, that's obviously very bad, but the complete story is even worse. There's one section in these newly released documents detailing how Chu worked with the Wuhan lab and the People's Liberation Army, and that part has not received much attention so far. Specifically, Chu secretly worked for the PLA through the Wuhan lab. The program which Chu worked for was the 1,000 Talents Plan. On the surface, the 1,000 Talents Plan is a CCP initiative to recruit Western-trained scientists. Technically, these could be Chinese or non-Chinese scientists, but in practice, they're usually Chinese. But the real purpose of the plan is to obtain highly advanced Western technology, which in the case of Chu was Western biotechnology. And once that is stolen, it is sent to China for Chinese military use. Participants get secretly paid on top of whatever salary they draw from their official jobs. Two things jump out. The first is the spying and sending lethal engineered lab viruses to China. Chu was a huge asset to the 1,000 Talents Plan. Not only did she work on highly lethal viruses and have access to advanced Western biotechnology at the Canadian government's premier lab, but she was also the first and perhaps only recruit in the 1,000 Talents Plan who had access to a biosafety level 4 lab outside of China. Biosafety level 4 is the highest biosafety level where the most dangerous experiments take place. You might recall that the Wuhan lab's biosafety level 4 facilities got a lot of attention in terms of the origin of COVID, but it was actually the fact that the experiments took place at much lower biosafety level 2 that caused the pandemic. Okay, so the spying and technology transfer is very bad, but what struck us as perhaps even worse, considering the 20 million deaths from COVID so far, was the PLA involvement, and more specifically, that the person at the center of the COVID origin debate is also at the center of PLA recruitment. For instance, when Chu was pressed by Canadian investigators, she said that someone called Individual 1 may have been running the 1,000 Talents Plan at the Wuhan lab. The document also reveals that it was Individual 1 who was shepherding the process of receiving the lethal Ebola and Nipah viruses from the Canadian government lab. So the person whom the Canadian Security Services call Individual 1 was also in charge of a Wuhan lab bat virus project in 2019 that used reverse genetics in order to create synthetic virus strains. In other words, a project to engineer bat viruses at the Wuhan lab. Chu is listed as being part of that project. So who is Individual 1, who not only ran reckless experiments, but also ran the secret program to get foreign biotech and ran the Wuhan lab's 1,000 Talents Plan efforts? We can now report that Individual 1 is none other than Zhengli, the Batwoman who is at the center of the COVID origin debate. How are we so sure? There are a number of smaller clues, but there's also one big clue which to us is dispositive. On page 119 of the Canadian document release, it says that in 2015, Individual 1 was involved in gain-of-function experiments with US researchers as part of a study that created a hybrid version of a bat coronavirus, one related to the virus that caused severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, which could jump directly from bats to humans. Well, we can only think of one study and one person that fits that description, and that is Zhengli. She did the study together with Ralph Barrick. We've talked extensively about that study on this show because it is in many ways the first piece of the COVID origin puzzle. Barrick had taught Zhengli the techniques of making COVID-like viruses in the lab and to make them more virulent in humans. And that is what the two of them did. That's what the study was all about. Which brings us back to the inverse Solvay photo. We already knew that everyone involved in the diffuse blueprint for making COVID in a lab is in that photo. And now we know that Xiangguo Chu, who who was sitting right there in the front row with all the Diffuse operatives, was a 1,000 talents plan recruit who was secretly sending dangerous viruses to the Wuhan lab and who was helping the PLA obtain advanced Western biotechnology. Thanks for joining us in today's episode of Truth Over News.